Got it. You got it.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So hit the slideshow option. All right. I'm Andrea Donlon. I'm a land use and natural resources planner at FERCog. And gonna talk tonight about short-term rentals in Franklin County. I've gotten a lot of numbers from of short-term rentals in each town from the state, so I'm going to present a bunch of those, and then also look at tax revenues for lodging in each town that has opted into the local lodging tax. Cover a little bit of the pros and cons of short-term rentals in towns, and also discuss what I've found from other Massachusetts communities around the state. What have they done to address short-term rentals? And then just touch on ideas for addressing the business type in your town. And feel free to ask questions along the way, because I won't necessarily be able to see if your hand is up during the presentation. The funding for the work that I've done is paid by the Community Health and Healthy Aging Funds. FERCog got a multi-year grant to that was called the Improving Housing to Improve Health grant. And it is very housing focused because, I mean, for one thing, Franklin County is estimated to have a housing gap right now of roughly 1,200 housing units. And so we were looking at, whether short-term rentals are eating into that further, if houses and apartments are being converted to short-term rentals, then that can further impact the need for housing. So first I'll start off looking at some numbers, and you might remember that in July of 2019, Massachusetts passed a new law basically saying that all lodging had to be taxed the same way. So it used to be just hotels, and bed and breakfast, but this leveled the playing field so that short-term rentals were treated from a tax standpoint as like any lodging. And because of that, there's also now a source of publicly available data on registered short-term rental operators around the state. Towns at this time were also allowed to impose a local excise tax of not more than 6% for rentals, and a little over half of the towns in Franklin County have already opted to impose this local tax. And the law does not specify how towns use that money, so I think it's basically just gone into the general budget, but if towns were inclined, they could use the money for housing related expenses if there was a project that they wanted to do for to offer affordable housing, or even rental assistance to community members, or upgrading homes, that kind of thing. This is a graph of the data that I have by town, and I'll be showing a chart or a table with town by town numbers of the exact same data, but sometimes people are more interested in looking at things graphically. But so this, on the left, it shows the number of lodging establishments, and so like a hotel is one lodging establishment. It might have a lot more rooms than a short-term rental, so this does not reflect number of rooms here. But the yellow color shows traditional motels, inns, and B&Bs that list themselves as hotels. And those, there's, Greenfield and Deerfield have some big ones, and there's some smaller ones in Charlemont, Bernardston, Orange, and Whately. And then there's some bed and breakfast like in Northfield. But from this graph, you can see that, Greenfield has the biggest number of different establishments, followed very closely by Shelburne, which has no hotels yet. And then Charlemont also is pretty high up there, followed by Deerfield, Orange, Montague, Buckland, Ashfield all have fairly substantial numbers.
Can you say what the gray color is?
The gray color is, I'll get into that in the next
Okay.
slide. So here are the numbers for each town, and I'll go through the columns and try to leave some time so you can kind of look at your own town and really take it in. But the first two columns are non-owner occupied short-term rentals and owner occupied short-term rentals. These are self-designated. Operators have to register with the Department of Revenue, and then they basically say whether they're owner occupied or not. Just anecdotally, I feel like these numbers are not accurate, but I don't know why people would either do it correctly or incorrectly, whether there's any incentive or whether they just didn't know how to register correctly or what. Short-term rentals that operate less than 14 days are exempt from the tax revenue, but they're still registered. And then there's hotels, motels, inns, and bed and breakfasts. And then the other lodging, I kind of put in its own category because there's a few facilities that are like retreat centers and stuff, and they're not traditional, lodging places. So there's a couple of caveats with this information. For one, if you live in a town that has multiple zip codes, then do not use, if you're going to go and look for this data yourself, it's all online. But the problem is if you type in the name of a town, it's not necessarily going to give you everything within that municipality. Like I live in Buckland, and there are people who have mailing addresses for Shelburne, Ashfield, Buckland, Charlemont. And so all those, they wouldn't necessarily show up if you just search for Buckland. And then the other thing is there's quite a lot of variation in what an establishment calls itself. And then the other thing that we've come to understand is that the numbers that we have, and these are numbers for 2022, they may not reflect active lodging facilities. So an operator may have registered with the Department of Revenue and then ended up selling their house or just renting it to somebody else long-term, and they don't necessarily take themselves off the list. And so I don't have any way of knowing what's active and inactive. They wouldn't really tell me that information because it's proprietary. So these numbers are likely higher than the number of active rentals in each town, but it still is useful to know how many are registered.
Andrea,
Yeah.
on your caveat list, you didn't mention, isn't it true that if you rent for more than 30 days, you don't have to register in a season to one party? I vaguely recall, at least that was being talked about a couple of years ago. I don't know if that's true or not, but
If you register, if you rent long-term to somebody,
yes.
then it's not a short-term rental and it's not considered
But
lodging like this.
long-term,
Yeah.
and the idea of more than 30 days or more, I don't know.
I think that's true, yes.
Okay.
So I think that people sometimes cycle in and out of being a short-term rental and not. But it does look like, there's about a total of, 300 some odd short-term rentals in Franklin County
Hmm.
that are registered anyway.
Wow.
I'll just pause for a sec so people can take in numbers in their own town and that kind of thing.
Do you have any kind of ballpark percentage? Is that 340, what percent of, well, of what? I guess total lodging locations? I, maybe that's meaningless, but to get an idea of how it might at the margins affect available housing, it seems like it'd be great to know what our overall numbers are. And
Yeah,
what percent?
you can look up, through the census, the number of housing units in each town.
Mhm.
And I did do that for a presentation to the small town housing working group using prior numbers. You kind of have to assume that each short-term rental is an actual housing unit, which isn't always the case, because there are some oddball ones. But there were some towns that were getting up around 5%, like Heath, Charlemont, Shelburne kind of thing,
Okay,
roughly.
thank you.
Andrea?
But yep.
I just want to say that the key question that I have about this issue is unfortunately not revealed in this data. That the first column is really the key column, which is non-owner occupied units.
Yep.
And the question that is not answered there, in my mind, is how many of those units in any given town are what you might call just regular old second home vacation properties that somebody built a little cabin and they use it for however long they use it, and then they rent out the weeks they're not using, through Airbnb or
Right.
whatever. That's a vacation rental property, which,
Yeah.
if you had more than 50% of your housing stock was that would be an issue. But if not, that's not the primary issue to me. The primary issue is people converting either single family homes or rental properties that would otherwise be used by renters or people who live in town year round, for their, for their homes. And if you lose those, the reality is that Shelburne is not building many of those, that we build an average of one new house a year.
Right.
And no rental housing that I know of has been built recently. So, loss of rental and home ownership opportunities, particularly for low and moderate income people, is a big concern. But I can't parse that through this data.
No, you can't. That's one problem. I mean, I have the list of operators and their addresses, and that's public information. If you want the Shelburne list, I can send it to you, and then you can kind of anecdotally look yourself. But it is hard to get at that very issue. So there's also another way of getting at the issue that is flawed also, but potentially useful, is there are these like data marketing companies that offer information online. One of them is AirDNA. And so you can create a free account and then do a search and see how many active rentals there are. Or, you can look on each Airbnb or Vrbo and look at these places yourself, because you can also often recognize them if you live in that town. But so, for example, I just typed in Charlemont and it says that it's got 32 active rentals. A lot of these are entire homes, the purple line, and then there's private rooms. They have little dots of the locations, the purple or blue ones, and you can click on a dot and it comes up with, a picture of the place, and it says entire home. says how many days it's available, the average daily rate. This also has the average daily rate for that town, $288 for each night rental.
Wow.
It's pretty cool. And you can then pay to get more information off of them, but I haven't done that yet. It's pretty expensive to do. The one city is less expensive than like a whole region. But again, the problem is, I typed in Charlemont, and then I realized that they have this market area that is not the municipal boundaries of Charlemont. So it counts Hawley and part of Buckland and part of Heath as Charlemont. So I did try Shelburne, and they don't even have something called Shelburne. It's called Shelburne Falls. It counts Buckland, part of Ashfield, part of Coleraine. So it's kind of hard, again, to see what is actually going on in your town. But then I don't know if folks read the Montague Reporter did a really nice article on short-term rentals a couple weeks ago. Natan Cohen was the author, and they're on this meeting right now. But and Natan shared data that they got with me, and so because the Reporter is a media outlet, AirDNA was able to give them data for free. So this chart shows at the county level how many active short-term rentals have been listed or booked between January 2018 and January 2023. And the red bars are for Hampshire County, and the blue bars are for Franklin County. And so this is pretty interesting just to look at for a while. It does show that prior to the pandemic, or even prior to the lodging tax, there were more short-term rentals on the market than there are now. It did go down. It's come up a little. I mean, Franklin County is fairly close to what it was. And then Hampshire County, it's kind of interesting. Like every May you have this spike. So people are renting for graduations and stuff like that. And then, how does this compare against the data I got from the Department of Revenue? They were saying there's about 315 short-term rentals registered. That dotted line is just for Franklin County. And so there's a disparity there that, like, it looks like Franklin County was hovering closer to 200 active places, and we've got 315 registered ones in Franklin County. Also, the other interesting thing about the data that they got was the average daily rate. Blue is Franklin County, red is Hampshire County, and lo and behold, the daily rate for Franklin County is higher than Hampshire County, which that was surprising to me. And I guess what it's telling me is that the Franklin County is more like a destination for sort of vacation time, and there probably are more whole houses that are being rented out in fairly nice places that go for a higher rate than the single rooms.
That's wild.
This is Heidi from New Salem.
Yeah.
We have one, that we know of, and that one is listed on here. But I think what you just hit on previously is my question is, like, how many are operating out there that aren't registered or are on the down low that we can't track, that we can't, I don't think New Salem is the hub of that. But it's,
Yeah.
I feel like there are towns that are probably kind of dealing with this, but you can't, like you were saying, Andrew, you can't really get any data to kind of support it or make any decisions or move forward. And so I think that's one of the, we've been trying to address this in our bylaws as we start to review and rewrite them. And it's just, how do you grapple with some of this too?
Yeah. Yeah, it is frustrating not exactly knowing the numbers. All right, so shifting gears to numbers of rentals, this is the revenue that towns are getting. It shows the towns that have opted into this room tax and those that haven't, and then how much that is bringing into the town budgets. Greenfield and Deerfield are kind of in a class by themselves. They have actual hotels, big hotels, and they're, getting $250,000 last year, which must be nice for their town budgets. Then that's sort of followed by Charlemont and Orange, $40,000 to $50,000, and then Bernardston, 25,000, Shelburne, 26,000. It's a good little chunk of change. And this is really showing that there is a tourism economy that's benefiting the municipalities in Franklin County. So the whole thing added up to $729,000 to town budgets last year.
Andrea, can you talk a little bit about the process for the towns that haven't adopted the tax? What they
Yeah,
need to do if
so-
they're interested?
So if there's a town that's interested in adopting this, you need to pass it at town meeting. And I think FERCog developed a model warrant article. And so we have that available for any town. I think it's on the website somewhere, but we could point it to folks that are interested. Is there anything more you wanted to add, Peggy?
Well, also, if towns are concerned about having to track these, the tracking occurs at the state level. Is that correct? And then the funding is collected by the state and then given to the towns.
Yes. So if you're advertising these things on Airbnb or Vrbo, they report to the state, and the state, if you haven't registered already, will, I think it's all part of the registering and advertising on these websites. You have to register with the Department of Revenue, and then the town, I'm not exactly sure how the town gets that information other than the revenue, but your tax assessor may be interested and probably would want to know which places are operating. This shows the tax revenues for 2020, 2021, and 2022 for each of the towns that have opted in. I put Deerfield and Greenfield in a separate box because they're a whole different scale. But it is showing that most towns are getting higher revenues each year out of these 3 full years of getting the tax. And then this is just a quarterly trend look. Towns get the tax revenues each quarter. So when you get the like December tax, this represents the rentals for October, November, and December. And so even though the pandemic slowed things down quite a bit, there still is a fairly typical trend of more lodging and visitors in the summer and fall, particularly leaf peeping season, and then it slows down in the winter and spring. All right, so shifting to pros and cons in terms of having these things, that this is a business that's here. There's good sides and bad sides to it, and some of you guys may know that I'm on the Buckland Planning Board, and we have been working with Peggy to develop a bylaw, and we've gotten a lot of people showing up to meetings touting the pros, which are that they do provide additional lodging opportunities in the region. A lot of people like to stay in non-corporate hotel rooms and have an opportunity to be kind of in a local place. And there aren't that many actual lodging establishments in Franklin County. They do provide supplemental income for homeowners and tax revenue for towns, as we saw earlier, and it brings tourism dollars into the local economy. And operators have an incentive to upgrade or beautify their properties. The disadvantages are that they can impact long-term housing options. They can increase the price of rental housing and real estate. There can be nuisances from visitors, parties, weddings, that kind of thing, extra traffic. And they can impact the community feel of your neighborhood if you don't have an opportunity to know your neighbors, if there's always new people cycling in every weekend. And then there are definitely places that have been bought up specifically to run as a bed Airbnb. So you have property investors who some are locals and some are from out of town. There are folks who are, at least in Buckland, somebody bought a property to build a new house specifically to rent it out as Airbnb. And so then you have like a commercial use in a residential area. It's kind of like a mini hotel. So towns have been, I did a search and came up with a list of the towns that have addressed short-term rentals already. And if anybody wants that list, you can get in touch with me. I'm happy to send it out. They kind of fall into three camps. Some towns have addressed this in their general bylaws, and some in their zoning bylaws, and then others have done a combination of both. And the general bylaws tend to set up a registration process with fees, what kind of dwellings can be short-term rentals. There can be a limit on the number of licenses given out in each town, like liquor licenses, but not many towns have done that. I think maybe one. And it can set up a process for complaints and enforcement, and then also local contact information for non-owner occupied short-term rentals. And then the zoning bylaws can put limits on the number of bedrooms that are rented, require owner occupied status, put a limit on the number of days rented for a dwelling unit, but that can be very difficult to enforce. And it can prohibit or limit parties, weddings, and commercial events. So in Franklin County already, Whately has gone the zoning bylaw route. Williamsburg is not Franklin County, but close to us. And then I think a bunch of communities are working on bylaws. I mean, Buckland, Coleraine, I think Greenfield might be starting the process. And does New Salem already have a bylaw?
No,
No,
Not
so you're
really.
thinking about it.
yeah, we're
Okay.
right. We have a very simple kind of thing, but it needs to be revised. It's outdated. I guess I should say we have something, but it's very outdated and does not reflect kind of this new economy based on the volume of short-term rentals these days. So.
Okay. So if you're thinking of addressing this in your town, the kinds of things you could think about in terms of planning are what kind of impacts they have on a neighborhood, what impacts they have on affordable housing or housing and vacancy rates. Are there places in town that are incompatible with short-term rentals or compatible? Should short-term residential rentals be owner occupied? A bunch of these cities and towns that have addressed it have required owner occupied. And what size is appropriate for neighborhoods in terms of number of rooms rented out? Planning board, the zoning bylaws all have these use table and your zoning bylaw can identify whether they're allowed by right or a special permit or prohibited in certain districts. This is just an example, but it's, I think, important to note that these are business uses rather than straight up residential uses, and can be thought of comprehensively as how do you plan for, any kind of lodging type, and what scales are you looking in particular zones. So that was it. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments or questions about the data. Yep, I see Jerry and Andrew.
A question in terms of registering a location for a short-term rental with the state. Does the state also require a building inspector inspection, or in other words, is there any inspecting that goes on to validate whatever is applied for? I guess the question in the past often has been, well, what happens when the place is torn up or, something crazy goes on? I mean, there was that thing that happened in Leverett a while back, a couple of years ago. So just a question.
Well, some of the bylaws, the general bylaws, do set up a process that for inspection. Within the FERCog area, there's a mixture of towns that have health inspectors that are the town health inspectors versus FERCog. FERCog health inspectors treat short-term rentals like any other lodging. So they do go out and they visit the site. They make sure if you're on septic that your septic can handle the quantity and that kind of thing. They do a mini, like check for smoke detectors and stuff like that. And then they pass that to the FERCog building inspector people. But I don't think the building inspectors do a separate visit necessarily. And then if you've got your own building inspector, health inspector, I don't know. It's up to the municipality what you decide to do. Peggy, do you know anything different than what I just said?
Nope.
Okay.
That was a good.
So what you're saying then, if I understand it, is that there would be a health inspection by FERCog, or or if the town is not hired FERCog, somebody who does at least that. But in terms of zoning or building inspectors, not necessarily at all, right?
Well, if your town has its own health inspector, then they decide what they do. So I don't know. They could not be doing an inspection.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think-
it depends on whether or not they've adopted regulations
Okay.
in order to address the short-term rentals.
So
If I
that-
can
The number of-
interrupt, I can
number of-
interrupt for just a minute too and clarify that when Andrea is talking about FERCog inspectors, she's referring to the
FCCI.
Cooperative Public Health District, which is just 15 of the 26 towns that have.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Andrew?
Yeah, sort of going back to the question of if you are concerned about loss of rental or home ownership housing in your community, and my understanding of at least the national data is something like 1 in 5 of every home that's sold these days is being sold to an investor. So it's institutional and other investor-owned housing is making a serious bite out of the opportunities available for any homeowners to buy housing these days, and particularly the low and moderate income homeowners.
Mhm.
And so, but the question I have is, if you were to go the route of Williamsburg or towns that have said you have to have owner occupied short-term rental, so that addresses that issue of non-owner occupied short-term rental, but it also cuts out, it's kind of a sledgehammer in the sense that it would then make illegal the person who owns a vacation property and you know, rents it out for a few weeks a year or something like that. So it seems, but you know, if they're buying houses in town, like the one you pictured in Charlemont, they're effectively removing that house from the opportunity for a family to own it and live in it.
Yeah.
And you know, so how do you make that distinction? You could say short-term rentals have to be owner occupied or by special permit, in which case, you know, if you were legally able to do that, then somebody wanting to buy a house would have to come before the zoning board and make a case that they're not removing that house from the rental market or the home ownership market or whatever. I don't know. Does that sound like it would fly or not?
Well,
Simple.
I've got a thought, but Peggy, you're the expert on that.
I would want to think about it some more, but it's possible that you could craft a zoning bylaw where if it was owner occupied, that would be, I guess, a clearer path. But you still may require a special permit for that. And there might be instances where you might be willing to relax that. But once again, then you have to think carefully of what will be the information that would demonstrate to you that that isn't a house that's being taken out of either the short, you know, the regular rental market or the homeowner market. So I nothing's screaming to mind, so I'd want to think about that. So I'm not sure if that would work or not.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you're enabling people to finance the fact that they have a vacation home, that may also be taking away housing, I suppose.
Also depends on how you define owner occupied. Is it, you know, the entire time, or is it owner occupied house qualify if it's 12, you know, 4 weeks a year or something like that?
Right.
Yeah,
We're up against that in Buckland because there is somebody who lives in Italy or something half the year, and then in Buckland the other half, and when they're in Italy they like renting it out, and
Mhm.
so they do live there but not year round.
Well, Peggy, some of the houses that come to mind are homes that are, you know, 2 or 3 season houses that are clearly not meant to be lived in year round, you know, that
Yeah.
were strictly built for vacation purposes, you
Yeah.
know.
so that might be easier if they're clearly
Mhm.
seasonal properties that you wouldn't live in year round, and maybe
Right.
that's, you know, one criteria. And so communities that have sort of expanded the opportunity to rent properties when they're not there often have like timeframes of, you know, you need to live there for 9 months of the year, and then 3 months of the year you can rent it.
Right.
But what that exact range of time is something that's closely debated.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think the goal would be to make it more economical to rent it out as housing. I mean, that would be what you're trying to achieve potentially, but that's why some folks have recommended, okay, limit the number of days that anything can be rented out, instead of prohibit the non-owner occupied. But with some towns, I mean, who's gonna enforce that? Who knows how many days anything's been rented out? It would be very difficult. And
Right.
that's what Lennox did, because they have a long history of renting, people have rented houses or apartments or whatever, rooms to musicians of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and they don't want to not be allowed to do that, or but they've found that they have an actual town planner, but they can't enforce it. So they're thinking of tweaking that.
Mhm. Mm,
Jennifer?
yeah, go ahead. Jenny, go ahead. Mm. You're
You're on
mute.
mute.
There you go. You're still muted.
There we go. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So
All
I
right.
think sometimes what has pushed people towards wanting to do the short-term rentals is because the long-term tenant landlord rules are so strict and difficult that a lot of people have wanted to get out of long-term rentals, which are housing rentals. It's really shifted to be very landlord, for good reason in some instances, and in others, it's created this market for short-term rentals because landlords or people are afraid to become landlords for longer-term rentals. So I would think that we shouldn't lose track of the landlord tenant laws and are they being abused and become too aggressive to where people don't want to be landlords anymore, but they find it easier to do short-term rentals. I see Andrea nodding her head. and
People
so
have come to our meetings in Buckland and said that exact thing. Yeah.
It's very, very real. And I think if it gets overlooked, you're missing a big issue, what brought us here.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. And COVID led to that. Many landlords lost, properties, income, and ended up in foreclosure and things like that. So there's got to be, I think, that should be addressed as part of this conversation.
It is somewhat state dependent too. I mean, I live up next to the Vermont border, so, things are different in Vermont, and that has, during COVID, I mean, there was just this frenzy of people moving in up there, buying, driving prices up. There are tenant protection laws in Vermont for sure, but they're not as strong as Massachusetts, I don't think. And so there is that as well. Differential, when people are investing lots of money to do this kind of stuff, they're looking around pretty carefully.
Mhm.
So Jerry, we're over time.
Okay, so,
So maybe one more question for Andrea and then we need to move on.
okay. Who wants to jump in? Andrew, go ahead.
Andrea, when you look at the bylaws that towns have adopted to try to address some of the issues that I've raised, do you have any examples you would point to and say, yeah, they did that really well?
I mean, each town is totally different. Boston is huge and they've got a scale that we'd never have. So they might have done it good for Boston, but that doesn't mean it would be transferable to Franklin County.
How about Williamsburg? That's one of the few that have actually done it out here.
Well, they, let's see, there was something funny about theirs.
So Jerry, I should just warn you that the time, I don't know if the meeting will end abruptly at 7:45,
Oh,
but I
okay.
just wanted to trigger that. So Andrew, maybe you could hook up with Andrea.
Yeah, I'll
We can put a little research there.
I felt like they had like too many stipulations and it seemed a little complicated, but I can go over, or I can just send you the table. It's pretty short to skim through it.
Okay, well, let's move on then. Go ahead,